Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti and today my guest is Shoumitro Chatterjee, who is an assistant professor of economics at Pennsylvania State University. We discussed his recent study of agricultural markets of Bihar, Odisha, and Punjab, co-authored with Mekhala Krishnamurthy, Devesh Kapoor, and Marshall Bouton, to understand agricultural markets and agricultural policy in India. We spoke about mandis, or agricultural produce markets, government regulation of agriculture, minimum support price in Punjab, his research on agriculture, trade, and the structural transformation in India, his intellectual influences, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Shoumitro, welcome to the show. It is so great to finally have a chance to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me. The pleasure is all mine.
So, I want to get right to this really important policy study that you've written with your co-authors for CASI. And the way I think about agricultural policy in India is that it's across three major policy areas. One is that the government, both at the union and the state level, subsidizes agricultural inputs. The second, of course, is, regulating agricultural technology. This is typically in the form of GMO seeds or, regulating what kind of yields or seeds that Indian farmers can import or export from other countries and so on. And the third part is agricultural markets, right? And this has come under a lot of scrutiny recently because of course, the major farm reform bills in India and the protests by farmers across the country. So the agricultural market system in India has a lot of variation. So one part of it is, of course, the agricultural produce markets, which are regulated, the APMC mandis. But there are various other ways of actually selling agricultural produce, right? Some of it is just directly to the government. Some of it is self-consumption. It's not even for sale. Some of it is sold literally at the farm gate. Some of it is sold through an entire chain of intermediaries. So can you just walk us through this really complex and highly variable system of agricultural produce markets in India?
In terms of agricultural markets, I guess if there is sort of one sort of main finding of our study, it is that things are very complex, not only across states, but also within states, and sometimes also for the same commodity within the same state. In places like Bihar and Odisha, which were sort of the two of the main states that we studied, you don't have your quote-unquote APMC markets in the sense that Bihar had done away with the APMC regulations in the mid-2000s. Odisha has something called a regulated marketing committee, but it's not the APMC that people understand sort of in the popular imagination. Regulated marketing committees are mostly sites for procurement of paddy. So other commodities in Odisha usually would not go through these RMCs. For example, chilies in Sambalpur is like an important commodity. For a very long time, it has been sort of controlled by a syndicate, a group of traders who have connections with other traders in the Azadpur Mandi. And they sort of contract with other sort of local intermediaries who pick up chilies at the farm gate from farmers and then arrange for transportation. A completely sort of different commodity in Odisha is prawns. Prawn revolution in India is a fantastic story of sort of transformation in the agricultural sector. There, the supply chains are very localized and immediately become international. So you have the processing plants who contract with farmers. They send their refrigerated trucks to pick up when the harvest is ready. They process it. These are world-class facilities. And then they are immediately shipped to the Visakhapatnam port in refrigerated trucks and exported. Beetle wine is another commodity and again kind of has its own chain. For all the commodities that we studied in the report, both in the main section and in the appendix, there is the supply chains of all these commodities have been mapped out. And so what we focused on in the report was understanding the first sale to a great degree of agricultural products in Bihar and Odisha, and then to some extent, the second layer or the third layer of the supply chain. And let me start there and not in Punjab, because our understanding of Punjab kind of muddles our understanding of agriculture in general, because I think Punjab and Haryana are very special cases, and that's not how the rest of the country works. What we found in Bihar and Odisha is that almost all sales were at the farm gate. So typically, traders would show up in villages at the farm gate and farmers would sell to them. The first thing that occurs is payment. And so I always like saying that farm incomes are revenues times quantity minus cost. And the policy focus tends to be on price, and we forget the rest of the profit equation. So in order to understand my realized income, I need to know what the Q is, what the quantity is, even after production. Surprisingly, maybe in Bihar and Odisha, a large fraction of payment is actually done by electronic weighing scales, even when sales occur at the farm gate level. Now you compare this to Punjab, where you would expect that marketing systems are better. Payment almost everywhere is using manual weighing scales. And payment is one way in which intermediaries would make some cut. These are not huge margins, but this is when you start making something. Okay, now your commodity is weighed. The second thing is about prices. You're promised a price on the spot, but you're never paid on the spot. In fact, nowhere in the country or in the developing world are you paid on the spot. It's essentially because these supply chains function on credit. Once the intermediary buys from you, they have to sell it to somebody down the supply chain, and once they get paid, they will pay you. Now that's where the second sort of layer occurs. Is I promise you X rupees a ton today. Tomorrow I say, okay, I bought this much from you, but 2% or 3% of that was dust. So here is the deduction and here is what you get. These were some of the issues that mandis were supposed to solve. And when we talk about mandis, I can come back to that. Typically in Bihar and Odisha, you get paid within 2 weeks or something.
Yeah, so I believe you actually get paid faster in the market through intermediaries than through the government, right? The government takes a really long time to clear payments.
Let's take a specific example in Bihar. Let's situate ourselves either close to the Gulab Bagh Mandi or Bihar Sharif Mandi, which are sort of large mandis in Bihar. These are not APMC mandis in the sense that they are not regulated, but they are markets. They're large market sites where there is trader to trader interaction or maybe large farmer to trader interaction.
And the difference being that these are sites where farmers and traders can choose to come. It's not a mandate to only sell there because of some kind of regulated APMC monopoly. Is that the correct distinction?
Well, that is one distinction, but that distinction was also valid some years ago. I think those reforms had already started happening in the sense that for many commodities in many states, nobody sort of forced you to go to the mandi any longer. Especially if you were like a small farm, even if the regulations existed in the letter of the law, if you were a small farmer, you were too small for anybody to care about you. So even if you sold to the large farmer in the village, who then took your produce to the mandi, nobody would sort of trouble you that why did you sell to this large farmer? I mean, even if it was not by the letter of the law. So there are intermediaries who can buy at the farm gate. And then as a farmer, if you had enough of an output such that it made economic sense for you to rent a vehicle or own a vehicle to transport it, you could go to the mandi. When you're close to these market sites, the price in these mandis do serve as an anchor of what is the price that you would get at the farm gate. Because, we don't have any good market intelligence system like that exists in the US. So that's kind of my benchmark price. It could be possible that the intermediary who is buying from me at the farm gate will eventually sell it in the mandi.
And takes a cut.
No, but the cut, we have to remember why the cut is for. Like, it could be an inefficient cut in the sense that it is a markup, or it could be substituting for a service. So of course, transportation, storage, etc. But also if there is a lag in payment at the mandi. So suppose at the mandi, the large intermediary pays me after a month. As a farmer, I can choose to sell to this guy, get a better price, but then I have to get paid after a month. Or I can sell to somebody in between, get paid immediately, but that difference in the 2 weeks of payments shows up then as a difference in the price. How do I get paid? Almost all transactions are in cash in Bihar and Odisha. In Punjab, you do see some payment either by check or by bank transfers. What was also interesting to note is, and this is consistent with what others have found, is that Bihar and Odisha markets do not usually reward post-harvest processes. So things like cleaning, grading, and drying. And I don't know if it's a consequence or if the causality runs the other way, but because the market is not rewarding post-harvest processes, most farmers are also not engaging in post-harvest processes. The only one they try to do is drying. And that shows up as a mild, and then those who dry then get a like 1% or a 1.5% better price for their output. And the last thing is price discovery. So because you don't have regulated markets in Bihar and Odisha, almost nowhere do you see auctions or anything of that sort. It's mostly bilateral bargaining. Whereas in Punjab, for non-MSP commodities, where it's not going to the government, there is almost always an auction. Now, there is the other question of whether auctions themselves are improving prices, i.e., if we were to do auctions in Bihar and Odisha, would that improve prices? I don't know the answer to that question. I think that depends on a whole host of things, including can intermediaries collude and beat the auction? Because, of course, it is possible to beat the auction. Remember, though, that technically the way auctions are defined in the regulated acts, they're not auctions in the sense that we study them, because when we study a first price, second price auction, it means that the price that is discovered is then binding. In agricultural markets, the price that is discovered then can be renegotiated, including the farmer. Both the farmer and the intermediary can expose, say that I don't agree to this, and so let's not go ahead with the trade. Very often it happens that the buyers say that I looked at the top of the grain, which looked good, and therefore this is the price that I bid. Now that I'm looking at the full crop or the full lot, I realize that this is a bad quality, so I'll offer you a low price. But by that time, the farmer has already paid the fixed cost, right?
Yes.
So your stuff is already unloaded.
And all the other potential buyers have walked away.
So when you have good regulated markets and strong regulated markets, these are the situations that can get resolved. So in MP, which is why for me, like the real example, like the benchmark should be Madhya Pradesh, because these things get enforced quite well, in the sense that if you try to cheat farmers, the marketing committee, the secretary or somebody will say, no, this is not what you can do. If you try to do this, I'm going to liquidate your asset, which you kept for the license.
I just want to take one step back and think about agricultural markets in a way that we would think about, like, say, idealized markets. I'm thinking about something like Aalsmeer in Netherlands, where the tulips come batch after batch and you have everyone doing a Dutch auction and they press the button and the tulips are sold, right? And you have pretty much every single mechanism. You have the transportation, you have the cold storage, you have very, very thick markets, large numbers of buyers and sellers. You have flowers coming in from Kenya, which are going to the United States, but are being sold, or at least the deal is being struck midway in Netherlands. So now, what are the kinds of structural bottlenecks and what are the kinds of legal bottlenecks in creating these massive idealized sort of market conditions where you have very, very thick markets for agricultural produce in India?
I guess what will help is if we take one step back and talk about when mandis exist, what do they do, and do they help in any way? And then I can come and sort of answer this question more directly. So the original idea behind why mandis were established, they wanted to solve 3 or 4 economic problems. We spoke about counterparty risk, right? Then there is dispute resolution. So if my trader does not honor his promise, whom do I go to? Then is the question about price discovery. How should we discover the price? Should it be bilateral negotiation? Should it be auctions? Or should it be something else? And for whatever reason, we thought that auctions, the way it is defined, would be the best way. And the fourth thing that the mandi sort of implicitly do is information dissemination, which is that even for off mandi transactions, how do I know what the market price is? And in Bihar, sort of in remote areas in Bihar, so there's a chapter on remoteness where we talk about this becomes a huge concern. And the fifth thing, which is very, very important and critical for agricultural products, is quality assaying, right? So I bring in grains, of course, and I like when I give sort of seminars and people say that agricultural commodities are homogeneous. My reaction is no, when you go and buy tomatoes in Whole Foods, you don't just buy a random tomato. So even like basmati rice, the full grain rice is different from a broken rice. When farmers bring in commodities, it's a mix of stuff, right? Like you have good grains and you have some broken grains and there is some moisture content and some dust and some pest. This is not like milk. So the big revolution in the milk was the lactometer, that you could put an independent thing inside and that would tell you, irrespective of like independent of the buyer and the seller, what was the quality of the milk, which I could rely on and you could rely on. The way it works in agricultural markets in India today is that the intermediaries are performing that economic function. So Bihar is one of the largest producers of fresh vegetables, and vegetables from there get transported to Delhi. The buyers in Delhi want a certain quality of tomato or cabbage or something to be shipped. How do they know that they will get that quality? And that is ultimately insured or backed by our intermediaries. Even in MP for the soya bean market, the private mills, they want a certain quality of soya beans sort of delivered to them. How do they know that they will get it? That quality assaying aspect is sort of done by the intermediaries. And once you think through those channels, there are many ways in which our markets are incomplete, right? So our markets are sort of spatially incomplete. Our markets are temporally incomplete because we don't have well-functioning insurance markets, and we can talk about that in more detail. We don't have independent quality assaying going on. And then how do you credibly convey information? I think all these are complete markets, and all actors sort of being price takers are your basic ingredients for the first welfare theorem to hold. And those would be the basic ingredients for any market to function. There is variation across states, but we are far away from those aspects.
Is the problem that the original design, that is the legal and policy design of the mandis, was flawed? Or is it that the legal design was correct, but they simply didn't have the enforcement mechanism or state capacity for things like dispute resolution, quality control, and so on? So have they been captured by interest groups? Is there just a lack of trust in the sellers to go to the mandi? Is it remoteness and transportation? Because the farmers are so small that they may lack the ability to actually physically be present at these places to get the information. Can you give us a picture of what is it that is the roadblock?
I think it would be a little bit of everything. But just to go back to the policy aspect, one thing that we have to realize is that policy is not time invariant. I think when these policies were made initially, I'm going back to the 1928 Royal Commission report and subsequently the initial APMC acts, at that time it made a lot of sense. In fact, if you look at historic data, that did increase farm incomes substantially. Over time, of course, what happened was, within mandis, you saw cartels amongst intermediaries of the sort that you are describing. Licensing, like obtaining new licenses, there should have been no barriers to obtaining new licenses. There were. The states should have invested more in mandis. So the first part of my dissertation exactly shows this, that in parts of the country, when you have more well-functioning mandis, it leads to a better price realization for farmers. And in places when you have fewer mandis, it leads to depressed prices. So mandis, I view for India at least, I view them as a public good. It's nothing different than a railway station. But what this is saying is that states should have invested more in mandis. I mean, if you think about the chili syndicate that we were talking about in Odisha, those farmers whom we interviewed, they have been asking for a mandi for a very long time. They understand that if there is a mandi, that syndicate would face then competition from other buyers who would know that this is a place where you can find chili. And the absence of a well-functioning mandi kind of hurts them.
Yeah, so basically what you're describing is your classic thick versus thin market problem, right? For any well-functioning thick market, you do need some legal and physical infrastructure.
Exactly.
And that is exactly what seems to be missing in the Indian mix. And sometimes for things like prawns, the physical and the legal or contractual rather infrastructure has been provided by private parties, mostly people who are buyers from abroad who can afford to pay a huge premium to make this kind of infrastructure function in their favor. And for other things like chilies and onions and tomatoes, it just simply doesn't exist in some states.
So there's one more point that I want to highlight, but let me just say that the other aspects that you raise are also right, that India having many small farmers, so the farm size distribution just being skewed to the left, that is a problem. Transportation is a problem. So initially, if you have smaller farmers with less output, you are also not harnessing the scale economies in transportation. The initial leg of the transportation is being done in small vans and not trucks. And that is also contributing. So everything is then, so small things are getting added up into a big margin. On the investment side, I think a very good example is sort of the maize revolution that has happened in Bihar, actually. So north of Ganga in Bihar, farm sizes are bigger, right? And I think mid-2000s, Cargill realized that there is scope for Indian maize in the East Asian market because of a unique thing that the Latin American maize does not come into the international market until July or so. And in Bihar, you could cultivate maize at yields which are comparable to yields in the US, for example. And that maize can be shipped to Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on by April or so for the sort of poultry and feed sector. And they then sort of started investing. They sort of got in the seeds, etc., and so on. And the farmers sort of converted from whatever they were growing into doing maize. They realized better prices. Of course, this is all linked to the international market, so you're now also more subject to more volatility. What is interesting to note, though, is that Cargill is not directly buying from farmers. Although they are involved in the ecosystem, the trade is through intermediaries. It is intermediaries who buy from farmers and then deliver it to Cargill, and then Cargill exports. Even if you look at investments in storage, for example, which is being done by other private players, there is a difference. If you look at the capacity of the processing mills in Bihar, it's about 120, 130 tons a day. As compared to if you look at in Andhra, the mills are like 1,000 tons a day. This aspect of the thing has nothing to do with laws. Part of it is just investment. It could be electricity. It could just be the farm size distribution resulting in a certain structure of markets.
So it just seems to be a whole bunch of things which eventually all come down to small farms and low productivity. So I want to touch upon that for a minute. So one of the things I have argued multiple times, because my work is mostly on the legal end and talking about property rights, is that in India, we have really small agricultural land holding. There is, of course, some variance across states because different states had different land reform regulation, but also different states have different urban and rural land ceiling legislation that is there. But the average across India, I believe, is the average size of the holding in the last agricultural census was something like, 1.08 hectares. So this is about 2.5 acres. And now, do you think the root cause of the problem is solving the land problem, which will then in a sense, fix everything else because, there will be greater productivity, there will be fewer farmers, there will be greater investment and so on? Or is this just one more thing and it will not solve a host of other things?
It's a very good question. I think it goes back to two things. One is sort of obviously the seminal 1954 paper by Sir Arthur Lewis, But also back to my profit equation, which is my income is P times Q minus the cost. And part of my income realization will, in the West, the increase in farm incomes has mostly come from increasing the Q and not the P, because when you tend to sort of focus on increasing the P, we forget that increasing the P also hurts consumers. And a lot of those consumers are farmers themselves. So I might be a paddy farmer, but if I'm buying a cotton shirt and if you raise the price of cotton, then that reduces my real income. So yes, solving or thinking about how we can deal with the landholding, the small landholding size issue in India is one of the key elements of understanding how we can improve incomes in the agricultural sector. However, the flip side is that we also have a very large population. And then it partly relates to my work with Arvind Subramanian, where we talk about exports and so on. We really don't have jobs anywhere else. So the point is, if you think about people moving from agriculture to somewhere else, we have to also understand what that somewhere else is. That somewhere else cannot be unemployment. Another sort of friend and colleague of mine, Rohit Lamba, who's at Penn State, and a PhD student of mine, Abhishek, we try to look at the labor force data. And of course, a lot of people are just unemployed, right? The maximum employment, non-agricultural employment that you see, so about 10% kind of is in manufacturing, productive manufacturing, but a bulk of it is construction, wholesale, retail trade, so things like your local rediwala, a little bit sort of teachers and so on. But both construction and the odd jobs that you're doing in the services sector, these are not reliable.
Yeah, they're seasonal.
It's not even seasonal in the sense that it's not the case that I will get it every season. So I was a construction worker last year. This year, COVID hit. I don't have that job anymore. And if you have those kind of jobs, even if that gives you economic growth, that is not going to create structural transformation. Because remember, the two things that are important for structural transformation is one, in most models of structural transformation, you need agricultural productivity to be increasing. That's one of the first ingredients for people to then move, because then you have surplus labor, right? I can move outside agriculture without production falling. And B, I have some reliable sort of source of income to whichever sector I move. And we are kind of lacking on both aspects. And so I just don't know how this, of course, I think we will never become the US just in terms of the landholding distribution, just because there are just too many people. And where will they go, both in terms of jobs and in terms of locations? I mean, Delhi and Bombay are already overcrowded. So unless new cities come up with sort of new centers for jobs, where will they go? But definitely we have to think about how we can get out of this trap. And Diego Restuccia, who's at Toronto, has been doing some work on this. In Odisha, actually, one other way of trying to address this problem is you may not want to buy or sell, but you may want to write rental contracts. And a lot of sharecropping contracts and rental contracts tend to be on the gray margin between legal and being illegal in Odisha. And we were surprised when we were doing these surveys and initially these numbers were coming in, we got alarmingly low rates of sharecropping in Odisha. And we were just surprised. Like in Bihar, you get 30%, 40% sharecroppers. In Odisha, how can there be just 2% sharecroppers? And then we did more research and it turned out that it's sort of illegal. So when you show up with a survey instrument, farmers were not willing to tell you that they were doing bhak chashi, which is what they would call sharecropping.
Yeah, because it puts their property titles in jeopardy, right? That creates a different kind of a problem with the state.
Right. So even those kind of like the first step is to even sort of fix the rental market before you do the buying and selling.
I want to go back to one discussion we were having earlier about Cargill making huge investments in Bihar. Now, one of the really big fears, and here I think India seems to be quite polarized on the policy front, one huge fear is there are going to be these huge players like Cargill and Ambani's who come in, and they are going to replace the APMC monopoly if it were to exist in the state in the first place, and, strong arm farmers, almost like the East India Company, into giving away their produce for free. And, there's this entire narrative around a fear of big players, right? On the other extreme, there is this huge narrative which says, hey, we need big players to come in. We need really large sellers. They are the ones who are going to make investments in cold storage. They are the ones who are going to make investments in warehousing. They are the ones who are going to move us from a tempo to a refrigerated truck and, so on and so forth. A small player, small retail establishment, intermediary simply cannot make those investments. So where do you yourself lie in this completely polarized narrative? And what has been the contribution of really large players? And would it actually be better for farmers, especially those who are in states like Bihar and Odisha, relatively poor states? Most of the population is in farming.
So I want to say sort of two conceptual things before we get into the details. And sort of the two conceptual points are, you are exactly right that this whole debate with the new farm laws has become so polarized that the discussion that we should have had was sort of go clause by clause and understand kind of what makes sense and what does not make sense for us and what is the ultimate objective of the laws. As far as where I stand, and that's how I look at it. For me, there are parts of it that make sense. There are like serious design flaws, which we should think about in terms of what the end objective is.
Can you give an example of that?
I mean, think about dispute resolution. Right now, both in the contract farming law and in the free trade, dispute resolution rests with district magistrates. I mean, imagine a small farmer who has been cheated shows up at the DM's office, says, find this random guy who cheated me. I'm not saying that the current system is good. These are the things that you should have thought about and improved upon. Instead, you have gone and done something that just seems not enforceable to begin with. I mean, this is how the new laws have been sold, that they are providing more options to the farmers. But are they really, in the sense that you think about market integration? Let's suppose that market integration was indeed the objective. Market integration is about homogenizing things in space. What we have done is actually market segmentation. So you had the APMCs, you did not do anything with them. They continue to exist. And now you have created this another trade area with a different set of rules. So earlier there was variation across states. Now you have variation within states in how agricultural produce will get traded.
So unless one of them ends up dominating and becomes like a Schelling point market, you're basically going to get 5 thin markets instead of 1 thick one.
Yes, and then we have to decide which is the way that we want to go into. And the third thing is, even if you and I agree on what the end is, the means to the end is as important. Like, how do we get from where we are to what our end objective is? And that, I guess, seems to be the problem of what is happening in Punjab. And we can, but to come back to the question about corporates, I think the first thing we have to ask is, where are we in that landscape? The big corporates in some spaces do exist, right? So ITC is producing atta. The Reliance Fresh stores exist in cities, even in my hometown now, in Lucknow. There are other cities where these stores do not exist. And the question is why? Is it because of regulation, over-regulation, or bad regulation? Or is it because of some... So one other explanation, for example, would be that there isn't enough demand for Reliance Fresh type stores. And I know friends whose parents just don't want to go and buy tomatoes, and they prefer buying it from the local rediwala. And you ask them why, sometimes they would say that in the Reliance Fresh store, we don't get the quality of the tomato that we want. Sometimes they would say that I get a better price here, it's more convenient. And if those are reasons, then what we are trying to do is not the solution. So first, there could be other reasons. So in Bihar, although there has been entry of the private sector in maize, they are not still buying directly from farmers, and there hasn't been entry of private sector in other commodities. One very simple explanation is that there are contracting frictions, in the sense that in the US, if I had demand for X tons of maize, I would at most look at 10 farmers and that's it, I am done. In India, I would have to do the same with 1,000 farmers. And that scales up my cost of just having to interact with so many small farmers. And if I look at it from that perspective, then this vertical supply chain where there is an aggregator who picks up stuff from farmers and there are bigger aggregators who pick up stuff from, so that for the private firm, then they are dealing with one or two persons at the most. It is just an efficient response to the underlying realities of India, which is small farm sizes.
But will that result in a better price is the question, right? Like, will it actually improve farm incomes? So I have two ways of thinking about this. So one is, of course, the farmers are still selling to the same 10 intermediaries, right? And the intermediaries are getting aggregated, and then Cargill deals with only one or two people at most, right? So that's the feeding system. But on the other hand, Cargill opens up the produce to a global market. Right? Now there are people not just in Delhi and Lucknow bidding for the produce. Now it's people in Indonesia, people in the United States. I mean, literally, the world is your oyster. Now, if Cargill gets a better price globally than they would, does that get passed down to the farmer in Bihar? Or would it not?
I don't think there is an obvious answer to your question. There are two forces that act in opposite directions. Of course, this is assuming that government of India keeps its trade policy not like constant. When onion prices and cotton prices rise, if you put export bans, then that's the end of it. You're not getting any better prices. But having said that, so suppose that wasn't a concern, then is the case whether the corporates have market power. In the event that they have market power, you will see less pass through. And how much gets passed on will depend on how large the market power is. And the second is, can you get rid of the intermediaries at all, in the sense that are they not performing any economically valuable function? So let me give you a couple of examples to sort of illustrate this. There's a very nice paper by Dilip Mukherjee about the edible oils market in Bangladesh. So it so happened that I think early 2000s, I'm forgetting it, but the Supreme Court in Bangladesh banned intermediaries from the edible oil supply chains. They said, just by legislation, you cannot have intermediaries. This is illegal. And what happened, the thought process was exactly this, that they are making margins. And so if they go away, farmers will make more and things would improve. But the supply chain just collapsed. And the reason supply chains there collapsed was because everything, as I said, in India was working on credit and trust. So the farmers were giving it to intermediaries who were then selling it to the processors. The processors trusted the intermediaries, the farmers trusted the intermediaries. And so they were solving an economic function. Now, doing it overnight meant that there was no substitute for this. You could not create alternative systems. And if you did not create alternative systems, things broke down. What this also meant, by the way, was not only did farmers and processors lose out, consumers also lost out, because in general equilibrium, oil prices went up and that hurt consumers. There's a recent paper now by my friend at the LSE. She has looked at the markets in Kenya and the entry of agricultural companies, so agricultural processing companies in Kenya, and how that affects farmer prices.
Swati Dhingra, right?
Right. What she has found is that in Kenya, what these companies did was they kept the consumer prices where they were, and they pushed the margins down towards the farmers, creating a greater surplus for themselves. And so on net, they ended up hurting farmers. Now, this is not to say again that this is exactly what will happen in India. It will depend where you are, right? So it has been the case that for the prawn farmers in Baleshwar or for the maize farmers in Bihar, you have seen increases in their incomes. So it's unfortunately like I don't think there's a clear answer. But in terms of regulation, therefore, what you need is a better competition commission, right? So if you see instances where companies are exerting market power, you have ways to curtail it. But where we are kind of in our development path, we are far from. I mean, if you know the amount of regulation on competition that exists in the United States, forget agriculture, just in manufacturing, we are far, far from it.
And a lot of the competition actually ends up getting hurt by just government policy, right? Like simple things like bans on exports, bans on importing low price inputs, really high quality seeds and other things like that. So in some sense, one huge barrier to competition is, of course, those who have market power, but it's also this really ad hoc policy of the state when it comes to agriculture, which is completely depending on the political climate, has nothing to do with farm incomes or, some kind of systematic policy towards farm productivity. Now, I want to ask you two more questions, which are ubiquitous when you see markets in developed worlds and they're completely missing in India. One is insurance markets and the other is futures markets, right? Now, both of them actually help smooth out a particular kind of volatility. So insurance, of course, can more directly reduce counterparty risk and other kinds of risk, right? Weather related and so on. Futures markets actually are a great signaling device in some sense. When they function well, then farmers can actually decide well in advance how much, the P times Q part of the equation, they get some signal from the market before they actually show up at the mandi. And as you already pointed out, once you show up at the mandi with your produce, that's what you have. You don't have too many options beyond that point. So what would it take to develop these two markets further in India? Is it legal? Is it structural? Now, this is early Feb, so we've just had a policy announce an increase in FDI in insurance, right? Up to 74%. So there might be some movement there. But what about futures markets and insurance markets more generally?
So insurance markets in agriculture is something that has puzzled me for a while. I don't have answers, I have conjectures, but I would like to point you to a few facts, which is that insurance markets in agriculture, by the way, don't work anywhere in the world. I was surprised. So when I was thinking about crop insurance in India, I thought there are probably market failures. You're not being able to get sort of the asymmetry in information. People are reneging. I don't know what is going on. Let's look at the West and let's look at how insurance markets there are doing. It turns out in the United States and in Europe, the government actually subsidizes insurance. It's not like auto insurance markets where the private players are just doing it by themselves. In fact, most of the bill of insurance is foot by governments in the West. And then when I sort of started thinking about why that might be the case, and that's when I realized that maybe, and I don't know whether this is the answer, is because food is one market where all governments actively intervene to keep prices low. And so if we think about insurance as just hedging between the good state and the bad state, if I am actively intervening to keep the good state low, then I will automatically not get emergence of insurance markets. Having said that, there are various kinds of insurance that governments in the US and in the West provide to their farmers. So there is just yield risk is the one, the yield insurance is the one that we sort of understand. And even that is not fully successful in India. Then they also provide insurance against price risks of two types. One is just market fluctuation. So your prices fell by 3 standard deviations. It's an unexpected shock. You need to be insured for it. Important thing is that this is not crop specific. In any crop, if you face a price shock, then you get insurance against policy risks. So if the government follows counter-cyclical trade policy that has impact on your prices, then they compensate you. In India, what is going on is that all these policy objectives are being sorted by one instrument, which is the minimum support price, when it works. In fact, the minimum support price is trying to do more, which is food security, price stabilization, and increasing farmer incomes on top of insuring risks. If the government sort of will actively intervene to keep prices low, insurance is something that they will have to provide, but it may not work for India. So I wrote an op-ed in the Hindustan Times where I argued that maybe the most sensible thing to do for us is to start with a base of income transfers where you say that you get a base sort of income support and then you do pieces above it. So in the states of the world, when there are extreme events, then you compensate for that specific loss, because otherwise sort of developing insurance markets for India, we might just be It might just be too complicated given that we don't have records of most things. I don't know how large a farmer is. What about sharecroppers? What about renters? What about landless farmers? So it might just be best to do something that works for India. On futures markets, I so they are trying to develop it. It's at like a nascent stage. I mean, for futures markets to work, again, I think one big constraint would be how do you solve the quality assaying problem, which is why the whole ENAM thing backfired, right? I am a remote buyer. I want to buy something that is 1,000 kilometers away. I can't see it. How do I know what am I bidding for? Right now, somebody goes and looks at it physically, right? Either I go myself or my agent goes in the mandi and does it for me. This is in space. Now we are talking in time. So how do I know that? Of course, the futures market will tell you a price for a particular type of commodity. And again, the thing about small farmers will overlap with this and interact with it because it's much easier for larger farmers to maintain a certain quality. For smaller farmers who are just producing for self-consumption and are only selling a little bit extra in the market, I don't know how they're going to participate in the futures market.
Yeah, the transaction costs are too high, right? Because futures markets don't operate on such a small volume. They'll operate on very large volume. So it's only the intermediaries who can potentially participate in the futures markets in some sense.
I think that's exactly right.
India has relied, it seems, too much on minimum support prices in one sense. As you said, it tries to solve multiple problems, not just one of, food security or farm incomes. It has also led to a lot of other problems. As you've pointed out, it has led to and others, a host of environmental problems because minimum support prices are propping up certain crops in certain geographical areas that ideally should not be grown in those geographical areas. They just require too much water. This is the example of paddy in Punjab and so on. What is the minimum support price policy in India and what can be done to reform it if not the current farm bills?
Again, I think it would be instructive to sort of go back just to the history on how this started to understand how we have come here. And you will see what is the common theme that runs is that policy should not be time invariant, but policy tends to be time invariant. So what might have made sense 40 years ago does not make sense anymore. So the first part, I think, is sort of well understood, but for the sake of completeness, let me just say it. So pre-Green Revolution, when we were a food scarce country, you really wanted Green Revolution to happen in India. A Green Revolution, by the way, was an investment in agriculture and was not a legal change. It was a hard investment.
It was a technological shock in one sense.
Right. So that's something to keep in mind. But what came with the Green Revolution was that it was a risky technology. So it was new. Farmers did not know whether it will pay off, but it required investments. You had to put pesticides, fertilizers, and you needed a stable supply of water. At that time, it just made sense that places that have deep aquifers, places where if you had 2 years of drought, you wouldn't run out of groundwater, that's where it made the most economic sense to introduce them. But initially, to incentivize farmers to take up the Green Revolution technology, the seeds, so the government brought in price support, which is they said that you invest in this. In the event that prices fall too much, we are going to guarantee a minimum price. That's how the minimum support price came into being. But initially, the objective of minimum support price was only to keep the price from falling below a certain level. You were still not conflating it with food security. PDS and MSP were two different policies. Over time, of course, now there is inertia in this. You started with MSP at some point, then you started providing free power in Punjab, and then free or close to free power in other states. And so then you get politically locked into these systems. Remember, for farmers who are used to getting an MSP, this is like a salary, right? They are used to it. In a macro sense, we might think that, as I have also argued, in a macro sense, it might not make sense for the country, but for them, it makes sense. And unless you provide them with an alternative, you don't know what to switch to. The other thing to note about MSP is, so what is well understood is that the MSP is provided mostly in paddy and wheat and maybe some other crops. Now, Odisha is also starting procurement a little bit in millets. How the procurement activity itself happens and who gets paid, that is at the heart of understanding also some of the protests. In Punjab and Haryana, the site of procurement is the mandi itself. So what happens is, after I harvest my paddy or wheat, I take it to the mandi. Whom do I sell to? I don't interact with a government official. I sell it to the artiya or the commission agent. The commission agent then takes it to the miller or the processor. The payment from the government either goes to the miller or to the artiya, and then the artiya or the miller pays me, the farmer, in Punjab or Haryana. Which is why when there is any threat to this system, the system that I as a farmer have known for over 40 years, my immediate reaction is, what am I going to do? If these guys are going to disappear, how will I get this thing that I have got for 40 years? In other parts of the country is different. So I think first let's take MP and then go to Bihar and Odisha. MP, as you know, has emerged as the other big procurer of wheat in the country. Now, like in terms of volume, it's the largest, but in terms of coverage, it is not, because MP is just a much larger state than Punjab. So not every farmer in MP is sort of getting it, but the coverage is good. Again, the distinction is, how is the procurement done and who gets paid? In MP, the government procures at the village. The site of procurement is not the mandi, although there are strong mandis in MP. They set up procurement centers in the village, and the payment is made directly to farmers' bank accounts. Even if there is a threat to the mandi, they would not see it as a threat to the minimum support price system, just because of the way it is operating, right? So then you look at places like Bihar and Odisha, where procurement is very weak. So less than 15% of the farmers are actually getting access. So less than 15% of the farmers who actually have marketable surplus, because a large fraction don't have marketable surplus to begin with, they get access to sell to the government through, in Bihar, principally through PACs, the cooperative societies, in Odisha through the regulated marketing committees. But then local politics comes to play. Because there is limited procurement, because not everything will be procured, there is a little bit of corruption. So the bigger farmers or the sarpanch or whosoever is in charge would sort of, first, they would delay procurement. So after harvest, in MP, post-harvest, you have somebody sitting to procure. In Punjab, procurement is almost sort of, anytime you sell, you will be able to sell. Immediately after post-harvest, in both Bihar and Odisha, you will have almost no procurement or very limited procurement. That forces the smallest farmers, who are liquidity constrained anyway, to either sell to larger farmers or sell to intermediaries, who might then eventually sell to the procurement agencies. Sometimes they also put these lists. So outside procurement centers, they would say, on day one, this person should come and sell. On day two, this person. So there are proper lists given, assigned. You are assigned a date as a farmer on which you can come and sell. This does not happen in Punjab. Punjab, you can come and sell any day. And that list, we have found in our research, often is regressive, in the sense that the larger farmers get first dibs. And the moment I fulfilled my quota of how much I wanted to procure, the smaller farmers are again sort of getting left out of the net.
So now when it comes to the procurement in, say, Punjab and Haryana, right? Like, this has, as you said, it started with a particular historical legacy. It made sense at the time. Now it has reached a point where 2-3 things are happening. It is not particularly progressive, in the sense that a lot of resources from taxpayers are being spent on farmers who tend to be relatively wealthy. Given the income and wealth levels of farmers across the country, Punjab and Haryana farmers are some of the richest farmers, right? That is one element of subsidization which I think one mustn't lose track of. The second aspect of MSP is it doesn't induce or incentivize anyone to change course. And this means just huge amounts of environmental degradation, right? It takes many forms. Of course, there's a groundwater depletion by growing paddy. In Punjab, there's air pollution because of crop burning, which is not directly related to MSP, but kind of indirectly related to MSP. But there is also just an unwillingness to look for alternatives. And the way I think of the farmers' protest from Punjab and Haryana is, of course, the government has put them in this situation in the first place. But we have a bit of a transitional gains trap.
I mean, there are two main reasons that at least I have heard that the Punjab and Haryana farmers have complained about. One is that they think, although it is not mentioned in the bills themselves, that they think that either the MSP will go away or the government will start procuring at the farm gate, in which case, again, their local mandi is threatened. And I kind of gave you some reasons why that might cause anxieties. And the second is they fear about this corporate power. They feel that once corporates come in, they are going to push down prices. And if there are no mandis, where is the anchor price going to come from? All those are, again, sound arguments. I don't like empirically what will play out. We don't know.
Inefficient as the system is, their anxiety comes from a real place.
Right, 100%. But having said that, like we agree that we have to move away from this for the sake of just the national welfare, environment, but more importantly, for the welfare of the farmers in Punjab themselves. Because with deep aquifers, once you run out of groundwater, replenishment will take centuries. So we are looking at desertification of Punjab in close horizon. It is no longer a 50-year thing. It might happen sooner. There have been proposals, by the way. So people have put forward proposals where you said that you start replacing the MSP. Essentially, if you hear them argue from whatever ground reporting I've seen from independent journalists, not like media houses, what they want is some assurance in income. The argument goes something like this. I have X hectares of land. Can you tell me, like, with whatever crop I grow, will I receive like a stable income 6 months from now? Or is it like a completely risky investment? And they would point to things like, look at farmers who cultivate fruits in UP. These are highly tradable commodities, but they come and tend to work as laborers in our farm because their incomes are highly volatile. How can you smooth that here? And so for that, alternatives have been suggested. One is just replacing the minimum support price with an income support. But that replacement requires establishment of trust, right? So what I had argued is that you start doing this in phases, that you provide some income support to first assure that that works. Because we have promised farmers MSP, right? But the state does not procure grains from other parts of the country. So the inference of that is that the state does not fulfill all promises that it makes. So now when I'm promising that I will go from MSP to an alternative system, how do I trust that that transition is going to go, right? So it has to be done in phases. And there it was like, how do you do the design thing? Then maybe you set the benchmark at the 75th percentile or the 50th percentile, where you would cover like most of the farmers in terms of land sizes. Then you do an income transfer equivalent to the income of that farmer so that farmers on the lower end of the distribution get more than what they're getting. And then they would be very, very few farmers. They would sort of lose out a little bit, but in the aggregate, it would be politically implementable because you would have a buy-in from most farmers. But again, the job is how do you convince that this is actually going to work? In the current system, this was not proposed.
Yeah, and there is now a complete breakdown in trust anyway after the protest, right? So one, it wasn't proposed, and now it seems very difficult for buy-in on any side of the table for a proposal like this.
So Arvind Subramanian, when he was the CEA, there was a committee to propose a minimum support price for pulses. This was the year when the tur dal was selling at 150 rupees a kg. And we had actually computed, so I contributed to that report, and we had computed a kind of MSP for pulses that incorporated the external benefits of growing pulses, i.e. the environmental benefits that you get. Because not only you help the environment, you use less water, but you also use dependence on urea because it's a legume. And then To make it politically implemented, I think what the suggestion was that you keep the MSP of paddy and wheat fixed in nominal terms so that inflation weeds it out. And then you keep increasing the MSP for the pulses, but then you actively go in and procure. You slowly start weeding out procurement of paddy and wheat, and you intensify procurement of pulses. That would automatically sort of cause a shift. But it is still sort of a little bit micromanagement. So you have to decide like which policy you want to go with. But there have been some policies that have been put forward. All of them are sensible.
So now I want to just move on to the last of the three big questions. This is on inputs. So, of course, the input subsidies given to agriculture are just enormous, right? Leaving aside price support, there is, the huge fertilizer subsidy. There is, of course, farm credit, which is given, very small amount of crop insurance. One of the biggest subsidies probably is electricity, free or subsidized electricity, irrigation. And now another subsidy which has been coming up over the years is credit. So loan subsidy. So this is not a credit subsidy which is given in advance ex ante, but ex post loan waivers. And all these subsidies put together, of course, there are different sets of calculations. But a few years ago, again, from the economic survey, it's about 2 to 2.5% of the GDP. So it's a fairly large input subsidy. So one problem, of course, is, again, it tends to be regressive. The larger farmers get most of the subsidy, all these arguments. The other part of the input subsidy is, once again, almost all of them lead to environmental degradation. And they have also other unintended consequences. So the entire power industry is in jeopardy, in a sense. All your electricity state utility units and vehicles are in jeopardy because of this free electricity being given and diverted towards agriculture. Then, of course, there's the environmental question. If you get free electricity or subsidized diesel, you're much more likely to run huge pumps and, sort of indiscriminately get groundwater out and depleting groundwater tables and aquifers and things like that. So what is the way out of this subsidy entanglement that we've created? They are so large, they're almost impossible to get rid of. And they also affect Q in your equation as well as cost. So if your subsidies are both improving your quantities and they are reducing cost because they are subsidized, if we take those away, suddenly all farm incomes might collapse, especially for large farmers. So what is a good way to think about reforming the subsidy culture?
Let me just say two sort of subtle points and then answer the bigger question. One is that the depletion of groundwater, so sort of using free power, there are two aspects to it. One is, of course, that power is free, but the other also is that power is irregular. So if you made power regular, if you said we're going to give it for 2 hours, but these are the 2 hours for which you will get power, that itself has some adjustments. But over and above that, I think power should be priced. You cannot have free power because then you're not optimally adjusting for it. Then there are, even within fertilizer, you are subsidizing N too much and you're not doing anything with P and K, and that leads to overuse of nitrogen. And if you're overusing urea, then you're also overusing pesticides and water. And so there is that entire cycle. The other sort of point that I wanted to make, but in the grand scheme of things, if we even combine all the subsidies, Indian agricultural subsidies are actually lower than agricultural subsidies in the West. So agriculture, I think, tends to just be a sector where there is a lot of subsidy. Part of it may have to do with politics. Part of it may also have to do with poverty, in the sense that most of the poor are also in this sector. But to make things more efficient, I think the only sensible way is to slowly move towards a system where you don't have too many of these small subsidies, but move towards something that is an income transfer. There is one small glitch, and the small glitch is that supply chains everywhere are not complete, and that's something to be just mindful of. That should not stop you from reform, but that's something, this is the whole thing even with PDS, that should I just give you income transfers and let you buy off the market? But if the supply chains are not complete, especially if I'm in a remote place, I might not get access to food, not because I don't have money, but just because so similarly with agricultural inputs, if there is a remote region with few farmers, private companies might not find it profitable to supply stuff there. And then I'm not getting inputs, not because I don't have money, just because the supply chains are not complete. You might argue that in the larger scheme of things, maybe those people should not be farming in the first place, but those have welfare consequences. So I think the only sort of economically sensible thing is to slowly move towards just blanket income transfers, irrespective of what you're doing. Something on the lines of UBI, which are all good ideas, but it will be a phased transition where you do it slowly, and then you realize there are glitches, and then there won't be a perfect solution to begin with. We will have to sort of move towards it. We'll make small baby steps. We'll realize there are certain imperfections. You fix them, and then you do another layer, and gradually you move in that direction.
So now I want to move on to a little bit about you. Can you tell me a little bit about how you became an economist and how you became interested in agricultural economics in India and so on?
Everything happened by accident. So I grew up in Lucknow in sort of an average upper middle class family. And when I was growing up in high school, the buzz was engineering or medicine. And for me, I always liked math. So it was always like you wanted to be an engineer, but I was terrible in chemistry. It so happened that in school, like in class, one day our teacher was asking everybody, like, who wants to do what? And everybody basically said engineering medicine. And there was this one friend of mine who said, I want to go to St. Stephen's College. I hadn't heard about St. Stephen's until that day, but that kind of raised my curiosity. So I asked him what it is. And then I found out a little bit more. Of course, I was in Lucknow. This was still when you did not have internet at home. You had to go to a cyber cafe and Google and see. And St. Stephen's had a pretty bad website. But slowly one found out there was something interesting happening here. And then I found that there was a senior of mine who was actually in math in Stephens. And I asked my school teachers to put me in contact with him. My parents had no idea about this. And then I asked him, he gave me the usual spiel. He said, well, you go do engineering and then you do an MBA. So engineering, you do 4 years and then you do an MBA. Here you do the same thing in 3 years and you can do an MBA. Why would you want to spend 4 years? And I said, okay, that sort of makes sense. So I did not, like in the engineering entrances, I did not get into IITs. I made it to sort of the slightly lower ranked places. But because I was interested in Stephens, and you had to still then get a form. There was you cannot apply for this online. So I had sent my uncle to actually go and get the form for admission. And they were against universities because their sort of imagination was Lucknow University, where you're not studying all the time and other things are happening. And when he came back, and he brought the form, he said, this is a fantastic place. Like, it's spick and span. There is no dirt. There is no pan lying around. It's very clean. Everybody's properly dressed. And there are morning assemblies. So they were immediately on board. I applied. Then there was the interview. I still didn't know what economics was. Accidentally, there were 2 forms. So the first form I filled was for math. And the second form, just because you got it for free and it was extra, I filled it for economics. And then I got into both. And then was the decision, should I go into math and econ? So I again went to this friend of mine because he was really my only source of information. And he said, well, in math, there are 15 courses and you get a pay package of 10 lakhs. In economics, there are 12 courses and you get a pay package of 15 lakhs. This was like such bad decision making.
And so you did economics.
So that's why I started with a bachelor's in economics. But I remember the imagination still is I would be working for McKinsey or Bain and doing an MBA. But then when I graduated, that was the year after the financial crisis. So the jobs had completely dried up. I sat in a couple of interviews, and those interviews were all these consulting interviews. And I didn't particularly like them because they were saying, how will you increase McDonald's business by making them not give ketchup in packets but in smaller sachets? It's like, okay. At the same time, what happened, and this is where the luck part was very important, in St. Stephen's, they were notoriously known for not following the rules of the university, in the sense that if the university said you need to have written exams, they would make you write research papers. And so in my 3rd year, I wrote 2 sort of very basic research papers, one on game theory, another on development. But that's the first time I got a taste of what original research is, that you embark on a puzzle and you don't have an answer. And I found the process fascinating. Plus, I hated these interviews. That's when I decided I want to do a master's, and Delhi school was right across the street. So I wrote the entrance and then I went to Delhi school. Delhi school is where I seriously started enjoying economics. I could see sort of synergies with policy and stuff. Although at that point, I wanted to be a theorist because economic theory is really the strong point of Delhi school. A game theory, mechanism design, topology, those are the things that were stronger than other. In fact, I did not.
Did Sudhir Shah teach you topology?
Sudhir did teach me topology. In fact, I did not do a single course in econometrics.
Yeah, he's the gateway drug, right? For everybody who goes to deed school.
Right. I hadn't done econometrics until that point. And then I worked with two of my mentors, Moushami Das and Trideep Ray, her husband, who used to be at the ISI for a year as an RA. Actually, my now wife, both of us worked together. And then we got into graduate school. When I came to graduate school, that's when I realized that everything I've learned until now is probably like 10 years old. The frontier is just too far out. And then I met Angus Deaton, and that changed my life in many, many ways.
This is at Princeton.
This is at Princeton. The agriculture thing, again, sort of happened by accident because second year, I was completely lost. In fact, I remember in my second year, I went to Angus's office and I asked him, what courses should I do? He asked me, what do you want to do? I said, development economics. He said, but development is not a field. Like, what do you mean? You teach a course in development economics. He said, no, your core training should be in some core fields of economics. And then you can choose to answer questions in development with those tools. And so he said, you should definitely do some econometrics. You can take the development sequence if you want to. And at that point, I had started liking international trade. So I did the trade sequence. But I wanted to write like a classic international trade firms dissertation. And I had some idea which was not super impressive. I was working with it. And at that time, I was again lucky and got the opportunity to work with Arvind, and this was sort of his second year as the CEA. He was actually looking for somebody who would help him with trade, and there are just like fewer Indians who take international trade. I think there are 4 or 5 of us in total. He hired me to do something in trade. And then as it happened, he had to write the economic survey. And in his office, there were these 2 whiteboards, and all the chapters were listed with names of people written against it as to who would help with what chapter. Chapter 4 was agriculture, and it was blank. Nobody's name was written besides it. And I asked him, why is this blank? He said, no, like we will write something about agriculture. There's nobody whose primary interest is agriculture. So we have to figure out something. So I said, okay, why don't I do it? Like I'm doing the trade thing. I'll also do agriculture. That's the first time I read about agriculture in India and realized what the issues are. I think what worked in my favor was that I had already trained in international trade, and I could see how you could use many of the tools that I learned to think about stuff in agriculture. That is also the time when I met Devesh, and he started mentoring me a little bit. And in fact, at CASI, Mekhla had come to give a talk. And I went to CASI. I requested Devesh, can you set a meeting so that I wanted to talk to her about the potential idea of my dissertation, to ask like, whatever am I doing? Will it even make sense? Because at that point, she was like amongst the young people, she was literally the only one working on agriculture. And I had these things, but I hadn't done field work and I wanted to learn more. So that's when I met her. And then so that's how our association began. And then kind of I helped write, like in the 2015-16 economic survey, I helped write the chapter along with Devesh on agriculture. And then from that, we kind of wrote our 6 puzzles paper. And then Mekhla, Devesh and I, we were constantly talking, and we realized that this thing is so complex that not one discipline will be able to sort of even, and there are so many open questions still that there has to be like a systematic thing.
What is your writing process?
I learned this when I was in high school. So I had an English teacher who was, again, sort of very kind and generous and has been one of my mentors. His name is Stephen Daniel Supa. He is the first one who actually taught me writing. I keep sort of jotting down my thoughts. Once I have a paper or an op-ed or a narrative, I first begin by just writing in short sentences what is the one big idea that I want to convey and what should be my sequence of argument. As sort of both my advisor stressed that the sequence of argument should be linear. And so it just helps to just write down 10 sentences that this is what, and then those 10 sentences become paragraphs. Other than that, I just sort of stick to short sentences, not using complicated words, the usual thing about not using adjectives and adverbs. I try to write something every day. I did take the course by your friend Amit Verma to improve, but that is what I do.
So did I. And the final question, which is, what are you binge watching during COVID?
Binge watching is usually during dinner. So both my wife and I, we are big sort of Bollywood fans. So anything that comes out, and nowadays all the good content is on the OTT platforms. We don't know for how long. I think they're going to regulate it. But the last thing I think we saw was Tandav. We thought was very good. I mean, initially I did not realize what the controversy was about, and it only later figured out, oh, this is what was going on.
Thank you so much for doing this, Shoumitro. This was really, really such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ideas of India. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us grow by sharing with like-minded friends. You can connect with me on Twitter at @SRajagopalan. In the next episode of Ideas of India, I speak with Milan Vaishnav about how Indian Americans perceive India.